faith are simple. They're simple and clear. Things such as the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Those are simple ideals of faith. But they're much harder to put into practice, aren't they? And that is what we must always dwell upon as a community, is how to put those ideals that make us truly Christian into practice. And we are called, folks, to be more than hearers of the word only, but to be doers, as James reminds us. I just discovered a new song by Danny Goki that is great, and it includes these beautiful lyrics. Gotta keep it real simple. Bring everything back to ground zero, 'cause it all comes down to this. Love God, love people. We live in a world that keeps breaking, and if we want to find a way to change it, it all comes down to love God, love people. Isn't that true? Simple, but difficult to practice. It sums up that greatest commandment that Jesus quotes, to love God and love others as our neighbor. That is a complete, rounded commandment that encompasses all we need to really know. And yet, we must dig a little deeper and pursue, what does loving people really mean? We have unique opportunities, I would say, to love people in these times of trial, where we find ourselves in a double crisis. Have you heard folks say that? We have a tremendous health crisis with the COVID-19 epidemic, and we are also facing a racial reckoning in our time like we haven't had for decades. And because we are all impacted in one way or another, many of us afraid for our lives, it's easy to just hide our heads like Chicken Little and try to just keep out of sight and hide away and do nothing. Wait for the crises to blow over. But that's not active Christian discipleship, is it? That is not loving in an active way as we're called to do. Now, Jesus told a simple story with a profound meaning when he encountered a teacher of the law. That might have been a scribe or a rabbi, someone who was well respected in the community and understood the Hebrew scriptures. And that person was asking Jesus questions in the public square. Now, I'm sure he was trying to trip up Jesus and get him to do what they would call blasphemy. But Jesus ended up turning it into a very teachable moment for all of us throughout time. The implications of the story can read to us today. How could we see the story of the Good Samaritan in new light? I see a beautiful tan-faced woman with long braided hair and beads in it. When she was young, she had coal black hair that was gorgeous. But now she's quite elderly. Her strong body, where she was so proud in her youth, is now hunched with age, and she's bedridden. She has been having trouble breathing. So much trouble that her daughter is worried. Oh, this virus that's hit the Navajo Nation, is it going to take my mother too? Could her mother, a beautiful Native woman, succumb to this virus? You know, the American public has been preoccupied with COVID deaths in New York City, and those were horrific, weren't they? And then we saw the deaths in Houston, Texas, and now there seemed to be an epidemic in the Midwest. But we hear so very, very little about our reservations. And we have some very large reservations in the United States where Native people have been assigned to live. Because we don't hear about it in the media and we don't look into it, it's as if we turn a blind eye, as if we cross over to the other side of the road, just like the priest and the Levite did, those who had power and the ability to make change. You know, on the reservations, I'll be telling you what the incidence of COVID infection is and mortality. Now, it may be that that's become so bad on the reservation because the government officials who could send their resources are saying, well, that's up to the tribes to take care of, you know, self-governance and all of that. But in essence, when we do nothing collectively as a country, we are walking away in the face of death. Navajo tribal lands are in the four corners of the southwest of the U.S. Quite a large area is that sacred land dedicated to the tribe. It includes Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. You know, from Ohio's standpoint, it seems like a world away, doesn't it? It is geographically and it is culturally as well. And so we might struggle to understand what has happened there and what we could possibly do about it. But I believe in our hearts, like the Good Samaritan, we would like to see medical care happening in adequate ways and resources provided. Too many of the tradition keepers, have you heard this? That's the elders. That's the name for the elders. The tradition keepers are particularly dying of COVID. So who is our neighbor? Is it only people who live near us, near our home? Is it only our cultural tribe, our own race that is our neighbor? Is it only LGBT people that we have a kinship with and care about? Jesus took the command to love neighbor from the Hebrew scriptures. He didn't invent it. It came out of the tradition he was raised in, but he enlarged its meaning. It appears in the law of Leviticus chapter 19. You must not take revenge or hold a grudge against any of your people. Instead, you must love your neighbor as yourself. Sounds just like what we heard in Luke, doesn't it? As you can see from the context of this, it was about not being discriminatory, being kind and caring to your Jewish kindred. It was about what you do in your closed community. That was what the Torah spoke to create harmony, certainly. But for Jesus, he said, by giving this illustration, it's the whole world. It's all of humankind. That's who your neighbor is. Your neighbor's not just your own people. It's everyone God created in God's image. Jesus expanded the understanding of the commandment. And I think he did this partly through the story of the Good Samaritan. Because the hero of the story was not Jewish, he was Samaritan. And yet the Samaritans had some Jewish blood, but they were despised among the Jews. They were a race of people created through mixed marriage that happened when the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. And there had been wars and battles and disagreements for a very long time. So the hero of the story is someone on the margins, disliked by Jews. And yet, In that situation, the Samaritan stopped to help a Jew and take care of that person. Spend effort, show compassion, give money for the person's care. 2 denarii is a day's labor. The Good Samaritan stepped beyond clan loyalties to show compassion. Living in these times, we are pressed to see beyond our own families and our own homes and know who is suffering from COVID. But we must be aware. We must heighten our awareness, and particularly how it is having a disproportionate impact. Bill Sweeney of the AARP has said, while COVID-19 affects people of all races and ethnicities, there is a striking divide in how the pandemic has affected people by race, broadly reflecting historic injustices. Historic injustices. How does that affect who gets COVID and who dies? Well, some of the factors I've heard, in addition to certain health risks that we all share the risk if we have diabetes, we're more susceptible. But these are the social conditions that promote that susceptibility. Overcrowded living, inadequate access to health care, endemic poverty, lack of indoor plumbing. And that abounds on the reservations. These create and foster health outcomes that are detrimental and disproportionate among American populations. Isn't unequal access to resources injustice? I've caught very little on the news about the epidemic on the reservations.
They're not talking about it.
They're not talking about it, not often. Occasionally you'll hear a story. It is gut-wrenching for the Navajo people and others like them to lose their elders. They call them the tradition keepers because they are the ones that know by heart the stories that are so key to the culture and who still can speak the language. And those beautiful things may die if they pass. The CDC, speaking of Medicare recipients, that would be folks of a certain age, in their statistics they have collected say that American Indian and Alaskan Inuit populations have the second highest rate of hospitalization for COVID and the third highest rate of cases, total infection cases in the U.S. I hate to say, but the very highest rate among elders as recorded by the CDC is African Americans. The disparities among our African American kindred have been noted, have been spoken about by celebrities, thank goodness, as well as the media. So we know that is happening. We haven't necessarily done anything about it, but we know. What we don't hear about is the reservations. Let's look at 2 native reservations in our country. The population of the Navajo reservation, as I said, occupying a large area in the southwest, believe it or not, has 250,000 people. 250,000 people. Within that population, there are now 10,000 cases of COVID-19 and over 500 deaths. Without a doubt, the Navajo are experiencing higher infection and mortality rates, disproportionate to the white population. And the number of deaths, you know how you see those curves, we're always looking for the curve on the incidence, it's not going down. The Choctaw tribe, have you heard about them in Mississippi? They're a bit smaller. They have 11,000 members in 8 communities. 10% of the population in the month of August was positive They account for 5% of the deaths in the state of Mississippi, and they only comprise 1% of that state's population. Now, if you know something about Native history, you know that the tribes were moved from their original sacred homelands west, often to unfavorable environments. The Choctaw were moved from Mississippi, a lush and fertile area, to Oklahoma, which is semi-arid. They were moved in the 19th century. But a few Choctaw remained and stayed on the reservation and raised their families in the face of prejudice and segregation. And I understand that because there are so many Choctaw, the percentage is so high with COVID infections, and Mississippi has been ravaged by the disease, that there are some hate crimes, hate speech now directed to our native kindred being blamed for what's happening. As LGBTQ people, we are uniquely situated to respond to others who've been disadvantaged and harmed. We know what it's like to be treated unfairly, don't we? We know that when we are disregarded, when harm happening to us is ignored, we truly suffer. Through the years of the AIDS crisis, the U.S. government failed to act swiftly. Why? Because it was a gay disease. In fact, it was called that. Remember? GERD. Gay, immune-related. Well, anyway, gay was in the initial name. It was not HIV or AIDS. So it was their problem, is what society seemed to say to us. But in the LGBT community, we banded together, advocating for drugs that could treat and eventually keep us from getting HIV. We advocated for access to health care at a reasonable cost, not just for our own, but for anyone living with HIV and AIDS. And that's how the Miami Valley Positive for Positive group works. It's not an exclusive club. No matter your sexual orientation or gender identity, if you live with HIV or you have family that live with HIV, you are welcome into that group. Folks, love is more than a feeling. It is an action. Amen? It is an action. You know, our pets mean so much to us, don't they? They're the sunshine in our day. We carry their pictures on our cell phones, don't we, and show everybody. But if we, time after time, forget to feed them, or if we put them on a lead line in our yard for 8 hours straight, are we showing them we love them? Actions speak louder than words, don't they? And so it is true in the Christian life. We have to choose to see who is at risk. Choose to walk up to that person in whatever way we can and lend aid. Jesus' story about the Good Samaritan is clear. It has a clear statement from Jesus at the end. Those people who fulfill the commandment are doing so to love their neighbor if they show mercy. Even the scribe who wanted to trip up Jesus could come up with that answer. The neighbor is the one out of those three who did not just pass by. In this time of racial reckoning, let's not ignore the plight of indigenous peoples we've assigned to live on reservations. Let's acknowledge there are historic inequities that manifest in horrific outcomes during this health crisis. And also, we know this is true for other disadvantaged minority groups, for African Americans certainly, and Latinos. We can become better educated and decide what we are able to do for our own part. The LGBT community is as unlikely as anybody to be the Good Samaritan. We have not always been called good. But like the Samaritan, we can see clearly what a situation is and act with compassion. May we find we have that capacity to act in this time for the benefit of those who are historically disadvantaged, because all people created by God are loved, and as we love God, we will love God's created beauty